Okay, so we're looking here at the December 14 P1 ACCA paper. It's question 2 we're going to look at. It's a question about a public sector school and the role of the Board of Governors, etc. But really what I want to focus on here is how do we go about building our answer? I want to think about, for all of those of you out there who've attempted this paper and maybe felt like you've got the correct answer but failed it. Why might that be, and what do we need to think about, number one, before we even start to answer the question, and then when we're answering it? So I'm going to go through it step by step, looking at each requirement, looking at the marking scheme, and then giving you a suggested answer. Now, the answer that I will give you will be a very good answer. May not be 100%, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what is required in the exam. What do you need to put on paper to get a good mark in this paper? So if you haven't read through the scenario, please do so now. Pause the video, read through it, get a general understanding of it, and then we can work through it together. So hopefully you've read this scenario, you understand what the context is in terms of the entity that we're looking at. And the first thing to do here is always to look at the requirement, because it's very easy either to misread the requirement or to read it and think it's asking you something that it's not. So it's asking us in part A to explain, using evidence from the case, the characteristics that identify Chambon School as a public sector organisation. Now, what I would do in the exam is I would get into that and say, well, that is actually the first requirement here. Because any time that I see an and, so it says the characteristics that identify them as a public school organisation, public sector organisation, and assess how its objectives have not been met. That is the second requirement. So actually part A is 2 requirements. And if you just do one part, talk about the characteristics, for example, and don't talk about how its objectives have been met, you're not going to get your marks. In fact, you're going to get half or less than half. Also note the verb here is explain. So for explain, it's a mid-level verb, I would say. It's not up there with discuss, where we have to go into a bit more detail, but it does mean we need to explain, i.e. tell the examiner what we understand by this. So indeed, if we look at the marking scheme for, first of all, requirement 1 of part A that I've highlighted, the explanation of the characteristics which identify Chambon as a public sector organisation. Well, here we can see that there's 1 mark for each explanation of a public sector organisation to a maximum of 4 marks. Now there's only half for identification only. So do note that it's not going to be enough to just identify the characteristic. To explain it, you need to give that bit more detail. So that's the requirement 1 of part A. We'll go on to look at 2, but I want to think now how we could do that. How we could explain each of those characteristics that tells us that Chambon is a public sector organisation. Now, if this was me and I was looking at this question, I would be splitting it basically half and half. Now, that's not quite where the examiner has gone here. It's 4 marks for the explanation in this, and then it will be the further 6 in the next part. So I might have thought I'd get 5 marks for this, given what I know so far. But I'd definitely be making at least 4 clear points and fully explaining them. In order to be sure I was getting my marks, I might have gone for 5. So let's think about how we could answer this. Again, I want you to concentrate on how you present your answer to the examiner. You've got to use short, succinct paragraphs, and you've got to use headings. So I would be setting out exactly what I'm going to say by saying, first of all, a heading of Chambon as a public sector organisation. So that tells the examiner what I'm about to discuss. I would then be using subheadings and subparagraphs. So I'd be maybe setting the scene by saying it's not necessarily the case that the school is always a public sector organisation. There are many fee-paying private sector schools that don't rely on government funding. So that's why the examiner is asking us this. It's to see, do we know and can we discern the differences between those two? A public sector and a private sector school. Well, there's information in this scenario that will help me. So, for example, the first point here I would make is looking at this state-funded point. So you can see I've highlighted the state-funded school. Well, if it's state-funded, that means they're reliant on the government and by extension taxpayers to fund the organisation. So that would be my first point. And do note that I have explained this by saying what the difference is between a public sector and a private sector school. I've then gone on to say what it is in the scenario that suggests that this is the case for Chambon. So that way I should be picking up the mark that I'm wanting here rather than just getting the half mark for identification. The second point I would make is highlighting this report that is due to the government authority. Well, look, if we're reporting to the government authority, that will imply that we're under the political control of them. That means we will have to account to the local authority for many areas such as budgetary compliance, teaching quality, and pupils' exam performance. Now, if you in the exam said, in the scenario we see that Chambon reports to the local authority, that, although it is an identification of a point, is not going to get you the marks. It might get you half a mark, but it's going on to say what that means. So we've said that means that we're required to account for budgetary compliance, teaching quality, etc. It's that further point that gets you your mark, and to me that is the key point to understand about this P1 exam, is that you need to go on and fully explain to get your marks. Far too many students think they'll pick up their marks for bullet point answers or short sentences that do identify the correct area but don't explain it. You will not pass in that instance. You must go on to fully explain. So the next point we could make is the national curriculum is mentioned here. They teach it. So that would suggest public sector involvement, given that that's a standard set to ensure uniformity throughout such schools. So the fact that they teach the national curriculum would also suggest that this is a public sector school. And lastly then, for our 4 points we need to make, the member of the Board of Governors, and we're told that the Board of Governors is made up of local residents, parents, other concerned citizens. Well, that suggests it's a public sector organisation because that makeup is stipulated by government, whereas private schools could have more flexible arrangements. So the structure of the Board of Governors would also suggest that. So that's how we would approach part 1 of requirement A. And remember, we've only dealt with part 1 yet. We're only halfway through requirement A. We need to then look at part 2. So clearing this out and making it clear that we're looking at this part here, how the objectives of a public sector organisation have not been met. We also need to consider how we'll get our marks for this. So the marking scheme for requirement 2 says that we will get 2 marks for an assessment against the objectives to a maximum of 6 marks. So that means we're getting slightly more for this. As long as we fully explained it and talked about how they haven't met those objectives, well, that's going to get us our 6 marks. Now, one other thing I would suggest here is if you can think of any model that might frame your answer, I would always use it to do so. So in this instance, we know it's a public sector organisation. Well, when we think of public sector organisations, we should automatically think of the 3 E's. So explaining that to the examiner, we will say public sector organisations will not have the objective of profit making like private sector entities will, but will be more concerned with the 3 E's of effectiveness, efficiency and economy. So we'll assess them through this 3 E's model. We'll assess whether the objectives have been achieved and say how, if they haven't, where that has occurred. And what we'll do is we'll have a heading for each of our 3 E's, starting with effectiveness. So that means I need to say enough under each of my headings to get 2 marks. So once again, I'll subdivide that into 2 paragraphs. What I want to do is make it clear to the examiner, number 1, with my heading that I'm going to talk about this particular area, and number 2, with my separate paragraphs, that I want marks for each of those paragraphs. And the examiner will find it difficult to go past those paragraphs without giving marks, so long as you're making some sort of relevant point that makes sense. So for effectiveness, I'll first of all state that the primary aim of any school is to educate children and to cultivate an effective learning environment through effective teaching and provision of suitable facilities such as the library and sports facilities. So that sets the scene for what the objectives are of this particular type of organisation. Now we can then go on to explain that the closure of part of the library is a serious threat to this objective, as was the sale of the sports field. So we're told in the scenario they've closed the library, sold the sports field, and such measures may in turn reduce the ability of the school to effectively educate the pupils in the future, which is their primary objective. So that clearly states what effectiveness would be and how they've failed in that objective. Should get us 1.5 to 2 marks. The next heading will be for efficiency, which is an assessment of the outputs achieved compared to the inputs required to create them. So for a school such as this, that'll be the results achieved by students as compared to the resources we employed to produce those results. And looking at the scenario, we can say that at Chambon, the increased resources provided through the budget, they have increased the budget spend, but it's had no apparent effect on exam performance. In fact, they have deteriorated further, suggesting an inefficient use of those resources and hence a failure of that particular objective also. Lastly, we could say that for economy, in simple terms, it relates to cost control. Are we getting things at the best cost possible? And it's clear that the school and the Board of Governors here have failed to control the budget and hence also failed in terms of that economic objective. So therefore, lastly, despite the higher budget, there was still an overspend resulting in the facilities closures and indicating a level of wasteful and irresponsible lending of the public funds for which the Board of Governors in part must share the blame. So we could conclude then by saying that on each of those 3 general types of objective Chambon has failed to meet its objectives. So what I want you to take from this requirement is, number one, how to split it up and identify exactly what is required. But number two, how to go about answering it in terms of using your headings, splitting your paragraphs up, and making it very clear to the examiner exactly where you want your marks. This exam is all about making those things clear. You could know the syllabus inside out and still fail this exam because you simply don't put your answer across in the most clear and efficient manner. Okay, let's move on to part B of this question. And we can see that it is, firstly, explain the role of the Board of Governance in Chambon School. There's an and after that, so that's going to be the first requirement. The and says then we need to discuss, in the context of the suggestion by Sally Morall, the importance of transparency in the Board of Governors' dealings. So once again, part B here has two requirements, and we need to look at each of those separately and make sure that we don't mix them up or try to answer them all in one go. We separate it out clearly with those headings we used previously and addressing each of the requirements in turn. So the marking scheme for what I've highlighted as requirement 1 of part B says that we will get 1 mark for each role of the governors to a maximum of 4 marks. So again, we'll talk about it in more detail in the next bit when we look at part 2 of this, but explain does not go as far as discuss. Discuss is a little bit of a higher level verb. You're going to need to do more in discussing than you do for explaining. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail when we look at the second part of this requirement. But just looking at the roles of the boards of governors, well, I know this is related to Chambon, but if you knew the role of the Board of Governance for a public sector organisation, you could basically answer this from book learning rather than the application to the scenario. However, here we see that the role of governors may vary depending on the organisation, but in a school such as Chambon, the roles will include, first of all, compliance with applicable regulations. Again, note that I've given a heading to make it clear what I'm going to talk about. And now I'm going to give it in short, succinct paragraphs. So, first of all, the board is required to comply with imposed local authority rules, as we've discussed previously, on school governance, including its own structure, terms of reference, reporting rules, and complaints procedures. So that would be one of the roles that they would have. In addition, upon receiving its annual set of examination results, it has to report on those and any other regulations as and when those are imposed. All of those would need to be applied with. So the first role of the board would be compliance with those applicable regulations. Secondly, efficient operations. Now, this will go for any board of governors, particular though to a school board such as Chambon. We're talking about making sure the school is well run. It's a taxpayer funded organisation, so senior management must be supported and resourced as required to maintain standards. What will that mean? Well, we will make sure that the governors have an effective management structure. They have it in place and the quality of teaching and learning and the pupil experience are adequate and capable of delivering the required level of education. Thirdly then, appointment of staff. Linked to the above, which was the efficient operations, the role of the governors will be to make senior appointments and remove underperforming officers from their positions. Now, particularly here in this scenario, quality must be maintained, and if there appears to be underperformance and mismanagement, perhaps the headmaster should be encouraged to consider their position. Lastly then, budget setting and monitoring. The Board of Governors will be required to set and monitor budgets against key objectives, and they will be responsible to the local authority. Again, relating that to the scenario, once the funding for the year has been agreed, they need to make sure there is no overspend, and that seems to be something they're finding difficult in this particular scenario. So that's the explanation of the role of governors. What about then part 2 of this requirement as we've highlighted it? So we're going to discuss the importance of transparency in the Board of Governors' dealings with the local government authority, and that's in the light of Sally's suggestions. So that's the second requirement. Also, we want to note here that the marking scheme gives us 2 marks for each point on transparency to a maximum of 4 marks. So note the difference here between explain and discuss. Explain, we're broadly looking for 1 mark per point made, whereas discuss, as we've seen here, we will get 2 marks, because basically you want to think of discussing as giving both sides, or at least going into more detail to give contrary points of view. In addition to that, there's 1 mark for evidence of understanding of transparency anywhere in the answer. But I want to be clear about what's required to discuss something in this exam. So answering in the same way with a heading and then some short, succinct paragraphs split up by leaving a line. First of all, transparency and the proposal. Now do note that this is the proposal we're talking about, that she says we should either report late or select only the best results and give a partial report to give better performance. Well, look, transparency is a default position of openness and full information provision rather than concealment, which is directly at odds with what Sally is saying we should do. So that's where we're coming from on this. So what are we going to do? Well, a transparent organisation is one in which all available information is provided, unless there's a strong and defensible reason for hiding part or all of it. In this case, they have a duty to report in full and in a timely manner its exam performance and the reasons for this. They cannot withhold any information. So we need to make it clear that that's the case. They're under a duty to provide value to taxpayers who fund it, and as such must account fully and openly for how it has performed. In addition to that, if the school has been effective and efficient, it can report that using a range of metrics and thus show it has provided value. So therefore, reporting is an instrument of accountability and an important way in which governors must discharge their duty. So they need to fully report. They'll get the upside if it's good, but they need to accept the downside if it's bad. Another thing we should make clear here is that the local authority will use this type of information to make funding decisions and decide how to allocate resources, which means that full and timely provision is important. It also means that partial, incomplete, late or inaccurate data would mean that the local authority would not have the information necessary to make these important decisions. So once again, that should be enough to get us 3 to 4 marks, because we've addressed each point, we've given an understanding of transparency, and we've discussed it fully, and we've made it clear through a heading and then short, succinct paragraphs where we expect to receive our marks. Let's finally in this question look at part C. And part C is discuss the potential advantages to Chambon School of replacing the head teacher in seeking to address the problems. So there's only one requirement here. The marking scheme tells us that we'll get 2 marks for each advantage, And once again, it's only the advantages we're looking at, and we're asked to discuss them. So we need to give a good bit of detail. We need to fully explore each advantage and what it might be of replacing the head teacher. So we'll do that in the context of the scenario and try to bring in some of the key points from there. So potential advantages. Again, I'm going to use a heading to try and keep track of how many I've talked about and to make sure that I don't repeat myself. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a change in culture. A new head teacher may bring about a change in culture and staff expectations. Looking at the scenario, we can see that Mr. Bess is clearly experienced, but perhaps one of the reasons he's liked by staff is because he's unwilling to confront underperforming staff. We're told at the end that at the end of the scenario that he doesn't like confrontation. So perhaps that's a problem. What could happen there is that such a culture could be developed and be unhelpful. It may result in one interest being favoured over another, so that staff become complacent and student experience suffers. So what I'm thinking there is that Mr. Bess is really thinking about the staff more than he's thinking about the students, because he's reluctant to confront the staff on underperformance. So therefore their needs are being put above the students, and that's damaging to the organisation. The second heading here is sending a signal to stakeholders. A new head teacher would signal a change in the school, that Mr. Bess's regime with its tolerance of weak educational performance was over. A new head with the strong backing of the Board of Governance and local government authority would be able to effect the necessary change which he had failed to do. So it would send that signal, and related to that, it would make clear that action had been taken to address the poor performance, and that the two were directly related, the removal of Mr. Bess and the change. So ensuring that it was known that the board were seeking to make improvements. Lastly, we could say that it will facilitate change. The removal of Mr. Bess will remove one of the obstacles to change in the organisation, particularly when it comes to the new methods of improving exam performance, and that would enable those to be introduced more quickly. By introducing more efficiency, new practices and a new style of managing staff, a new head could introduce a new regime and address the weaknesses in teaching and learning and cost controls so that it's more efficient as necessary. So once again, I want you to take from this the breaking down of the requirement into its constituent parts to make sure you're answering exactly what's been asked. Thinking about all of these times we've examined the marking scheme to try to identify where exactly you're going to get your marks and how much you need to write for each one. And then when writing your answer, splitting it into clear headings with succinct paragraphs, leaving a line between each one, so that you are showing the examiner exactly where you want to pick up your marks. And in that way, you're much more likely to pick up enough marks to pass the exam.